Hello, welcome. Today we'll be talking about AMSCO, Chapter 27 and 28 of AP US History, focusing on the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. You might have noticed if you watched the last lecture that I've taken Chapter 27 and 28 and split them into two. So the last lecture was on the foreign policy of those two chapters, Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ. Today, looking more at domestic changes with a particular focus of civil rights. You can see how I've got my note taker set up here, looking at the context, looking at the initial movement of desegregation with Brown v. Board in 1954, and then the civil rights movement with a particular focus on Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65, and then Malcolm X, Black Power as well. And then we'll finish with a discussion of some cultural changes and some domestic changes of the 1950s and 1960s. So when we're talking about the context of the civil rights era here, civil rights is mostly the 1960s, although there are some important moments in the 1950s as well. Got to think all the way back to the Civil War, really. The Civil War, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, really the 14th Amendment, brought legal equality. The Constitution cannot discriminate legally against you based on the color of your skin. But even though the 14th Amendment technically brought legal equality, there were so many loopholes, and the southern states especially, but northern and western states as well, found all sorts of ways to skirt around the legal protections of the 14th Amendment. We've looked at Jim Crow laws, segregation, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, which says you're only eligible for this if your grandfather was eligible. And if you were a recently freed slave, your grandfather wouldn't have been eligible. So the South especially, but other parts of the US as well, had found ways to continue legal discrimination against African Americans. We looked at the Red Summer of 1919, right after World War I, that saw a huge increase in racial violence, lynchings, and other public attacks against African Americans. Again, especially in the South, but they were not exclusive to the South. They were in the Midwest, in the Northeast, in the West. The post-World War II era does begin to see some progress. I think the contributions of African Americans in World War I, and especially in World War II, a group called the Tuskegee Airmen were most notable. Did lead to some cultural progress. Jackie Robinson was the first person to break the color barrier, the first Black player in Major League Baseball. I live in Pasadena, 3 blocks from John Muir High School. Jackie Robinson is a proud alumnus of Muir High School and UCLA. So I got a couple connections to Jackie Robinson there. Played with the Dodgers, Brooklyn Dodgers, not the LA Dodgers. So yeah, Jackie Robinson, first Black player in Major League Baseball. And then President Truman officially desegregated the Army, desegregated the armed forces in 1948. And Truman's decision was a significant one. But Jackie Robinson's move to break the color barrier was kind of maybe more symbolic rather than creating actual change. Blacks, especially in the South, were still segregated. They still faced poll taxes and literacy tests that prevented them from voting. They still faced intimidation and racial violence as well. And so when we're talking about the context here, the 14th Amendment brought legal equality, but the South found ways to discriminate. And just listing some examples here, we've got poll taxes, literacy tests, segregation, and then actual violence with the rise of the KKK, not the rise, but the resurgence of the KKK. There was some progress after World War II. Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in Major League Baseball, and then Truman desegregates the armed forces, the Army. But still, you see all of these legacies of slavery that are continuing, especially in the South. And so the first real battle, or the first real victory of the civil rights movement is around segregated schools. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court case, declared that segregation is inherently unequal, that separate but equal is inherently unequal. And this got rid of school segregation. This overturned a previous Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson of 1896, which said that segregation was constitutional. And it built off of some lower court decisions, specifically Mendez versus Westminster, which was actually here in California, in Orange County. There was a school in Orange County that was segregating Mexican-American students. And not the Supreme Court, but a local federal court here on the West Coast declared that segregation of Mexican-American students was unconstitutional and illegal. So there's an initial victory here in California for Mexican-American students saying segregation is illegal. But the big one, the Supreme Court, the federal case that has a lasting impact is Brown v. Board, which declares that segregated schools, separate but equal, is inherently unequal. You can see Black families celebrating, but then also this is in Little Rock High School in Arkansas. Which was forced to admit 9 Black high school students because of desegregation. And this was this woman's experience, this Black woman's experience on her first day of school, being shouted at, cursed at, spat at by white Southern women. This became part of what was called the Southern Strategy or the Southern Manifesto. The South basically said, okay, we are going to do everything we can to prevent this clear abuse of judicial power. The governor of Arkansas used the state's National Guard to prevent 9 Black students from attending a desegregated high school. That was Little Rock High School that we're seeing in this photograph here. And so even though segregation was legally unconstitutional and schools were ordered to desegregate, huge resistance from the South. So Brown v. Board, one of those Supreme Court cases you have to know, from 1954, declared segregation is illegal. And that famous quote of separate but equal is inherently unequal. And this forced schools to desegregate, which led to a lot of conflicts in the South as the South resisted. You can only imagine, if the South is resisting like this against children, what are they going to do when adults start to protest and resist? So that was in 1954, and the civil rights movement really gained huge popularity and huge progress and steam in the 1960s, especially exemplified by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a pastor, a preacher. And he embodied the approach of nonviolence, civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is the idea of, I'm not going to obey these unfair laws, but I'm going to do it civilly. I'm going to do it peacefully, non-violently. John Lewis, who was a young civil rights leader in the 1960s and eventually became a representative from Georgia, just recently passed away in 2020, he famously said, we're going to make good trouble. We're going to make trouble, but we're going to make good trouble. We're going to make trouble for good. And so those two ideas, civil disobedience and making good trouble, really exemplified the attitude of a lot of the civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis, among others. The most famous examples of these nonviolent protests was the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks. The book that you all read over the summer, Lies My Teacher Told Me, I can't remember how much you read. Rosa Parks was a socialist. And so she was fighting for civil rights, for legal equality, but also fighting against capitalism. It's part of the story that's kind of brushed under the rug. Anyways, Rosa Parks refuses to sit in the back of the bus. And then sit-ins at a university in Greensboro, North Carolina. Sit-ins is where Black students, well, in this case, Black students, they would just go to a cafe and they would sit in the white section. Or they'd go to a movie theater and they would just sit in the white section. You can see the 4 of them there, and then the treatment of all of these white Southerners, attacking them, mocking them, bullying them, abusing them. And the Black people, they didn't raise a fist. They didn't fight. They didn't argue back. They respectfully ordered and respectfully sat there. This idea of civil disobedience, of making good trouble, really exemplified much of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. University students created a group called the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, again, all about using nonviolent tactics. This Black activism, Black leadership, civil disobedience did force some minor changes, but there was no federal legislation. This is under President Eisenhower's presidency. There's no federal laws in the 1950s. And so there begins to be a lot of growing impatience among the Black community, and some people turning to violence. And we'll learn about Malcolm X shortly. So we'll say MLK and John Lewis kind of exemplified a nonviolent approach, sometimes called civil disobedience or making good trouble. Some examples of this is the Montgomery bus boycott by Rosa Parks and others, and then sit-ins at a cafeteria or at a cafe by students in North Carolina. Those are the 2 photographs that we saw. But again, no real federal legislation yet. One of the most famous documents of the civil rights era is a letter from Birmingham Jail. Dr. King was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama. And when he was there, he wrote a letter that really became his manifesto, his creed of how to approach civil rights, or how to approach the fight for civil rights. And he wrote, "We need emulate neither the do-nothingism or we need emulate neither the do-nothingism of the complacent nor the hatred and despair of the Black nationalist. For there is the more excellent way of love and nonviolent protest. I'm grateful to God that, through the influence of the Negro Church, the way of nonviolence became an integral part of our struggle. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence." He's rejecting doing nothing. He's rejecting a violent strategy of Black nationalists like Malcolm X. He's saying, instead, let's approach things through love and through nonviolence. And when we do that, we will actually be fighting for what makes America truly great. Standing up for the American dream and the most sacred American values in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, freedoms and equalities. And so his letter from Birmingham Jail advocated for nonviolent protest and this kind of fight for equality. The civil rights movement really escalated in the 1960s with 2 monumentally important events. The March on Washington in 1963, and then March on Selma in 1965. The March on Washington, that is the famous moment of Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech, which I believe, darn it, sorry, I thought there was a photograph there. That's the famous scene of Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech. Nearly 250,000 people peacefully marched to DC in support of a federal civil rights bill. And you can see, what are they demanding? Equal rights, decent housing, an end to bias, effective civil rights, first-class citizenship. Things that, frankly, Black Lives Matter is perhaps still fighting for today. And so that moment in 1963, televised across the US, was incredibly important in gaining supporters. But I think perhaps arguably and even more important, or just as important, is what happened in Selma, Alabama in 1965. There is a fantastic film called Selma that is all about this, where local organizers decided to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, the capital, in order to demand the right to vote. They were being turned away with literacy tests and poll taxes and the like. When they made it to Montgomery, Alabama, after they crossed what's called the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were attacked by the police. They were beaten, they were tear gassed, they were brutally arrested and beaten, including John Lewis, who became a representative in Georgia. And all of this was on national television. All of this was put on front page of newspapers and the, leading story of the 10 o'clock news. And this really became the turning point, at least in terms of public sentiment, of how the public felt about the civil rights. It led to national outrage of how these people were being treated. And LBJ, President Lyndon Johnson, he sent federal troops to Alabama the next time that there would be a march that protected Dr. King, protected the marchers as they went to the voting offices to demand the vote. And so this photograph shows in 1965, Dr. King and other local organizers marching for the right to vote in Selma. And then recreated, I unfortunately don't remember the exact year of this, but this was during Obama's presidency. John Lewis, right there. Reverend Al Sharpton, right there. Some of the leaders at the time, other marchers at the time with the Obama family. And so, again, we've got these continued nonviolent protests. I'm going to just add some more examples here. The March on Washington in 1963, that was the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And then in Selma in 1965, when peaceful protesters asking to vote were beaten by police on live TV. And that led to national outrage and eventually more public support. Again, featured in the film Selma, which came out just a few years ago. And so finally, after the March on Washington and after the brutal attacks at Selma, the federal government finally took action with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, before Selma, okay, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, both signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. LBJ, in case you forgot, LBJ was JFK's vice president, a Southern Democrat. So Democrats signing into law this civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned segregation in all public facilities, including schools. That should have already been the law of the land after Brown v. Board, but a lot of Southern schools were still resisting it. And it ended discrimination in hiring on the basis of race, religion, sex, or national origin. And also formally abolished the poll tax, which again should have been abolished already, but the South had been finding loopholes for the last 100 years. My God, for the last 100 years, yeah. And then a year later, the Voting Rights Act in 1965 strengthened the Civil Rights Act. It ended literacy tests and other obstacles to Black voting. You can see Dr. King at the signing ceremony behind LBJ in the White House. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1965, again, the one in 65 was called the Voting Rights Act, but they're oftentimes called the Civil Rights Acts together. It banned segregation in all public facilities. It ended discrimination in hiring, and it ended obstacles to Black voting, like poll taxes and literacy tests. The Voting Rights Act has protected voters from 1965 up until about 5 years ago. And unfortunately, about 5 years ago, the Supreme Court basically ruled that the Voting Rights Act does not need to be enforced anymore. The vote is protected everywhere. Getting into modern day politics just briefly right now, what we've seen in the last 5 years since the Supreme Court has said that the Voting Rights Act doesn't need to be enforced, we've seen southern states roll back protections. We're seeing it in Georgia and Arizona right now, where state governments are trying to make it harder to vote. They're trying to have fewer voting locations, especially in Black neighborhoods. They're trying to make it so that you cannot vote on a Sunday, which is where the day when a lot of Black voters vote. They go from church to the voting locations. They're trying to require identification to vote, which is harder for communities of color to get. They're trying to make it harder to vote by mail. And so this fight for the right to vote is still continuing. The Democrats are trying to push for something called HR 1, House Resolution 1, also called the John Lewis Act or the John Lewis Voting Rights Act or something like that, that would protect the right to vote. Depending on when you're watching this lecture, we'll see if that's ever passed. But Democrats have said that they're going to try, although there's some obstacles in their way. Anyways, so now, Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, Rosa Parks, nonviolent protest. That really became the image or the legacy of the civil rights movement. I should add, MLK was incredibly unpopular at the time. He was hated at the time, especially by white Americans. Now, obviously, he's an American hero, just adding that detail. But there was a different approach, exemplified by Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, and the movement for Black Power. Malcolm X was not his birth name. That was his name that he took when he converted to Islam, what was called the Nation of Islam, which was kind of a Black Islamic faith. He argued for a more aggressive approach to civil rights. He argued for Black power, especially economic power, of the idea that Blacks should be independent to rule themselves and to govern themselves and should not rely on the white people to give them equal rights. They should take it, and they should be free to have those rights themselves. Malcolm X also argued for self-defense. Well, if there's going to be white violence against us, we should use Black violence to counter that. Fight fire with fire, I suppose. Oftentimes exemplified by the Black Panther movement, which advocated self-rule, racial separatism of basically we cannot coexist with white people. This more aggressive approach especially became popular in the 1960s as riots spread. There were riots in 1965 in Watts, South Central LA, after a 21-year-old Black man was killed by the police. Very similar to what will happen 3 decades later with Rodney King. There were more riots in 1968 after Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And a federal investigation actually declared that the cause of the riots was racism and segregation, which is quite a shocking conclusion for the federal government to make 50 years ago. This federal government declared in a government document that the US has 2 societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. So the federal government, especially under Lyndon B. Johnson, came to acknowledge the harm that racism and segregation had played on the Black community. And many Black activists, turned to more aggressive approaches, including violence. So we'll just say Malcolm X led the Black Power movement, and they advocated self-rule and violence when necessary to fight for equality. If you know the film Black Panther, Killmonger was modeled after Malcolm X. Killmonger is all about, we need to use weapons. We need to use violence, vibranium from Wakanda. to help Black people fight for independence, fight for equality, and fight for self-rule. So if you think of Killmonger from Black Panther, that's modeled after Malcolm X. All right, shifting gears for our last 3 or 4 slides to look at more domestic changes. Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, was the president during, I don't know where I'm gonna put myself right there, whatever, was the president during the 1960s, 63 to 69, after JFK was killed. Inaugurated 2 hours after Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. And LBJ really took a very aggressive and progressive approach to his domestic legislation with something that he called the Great Society. Basically, he wanted to expand on the New Deal that FDR had built. He created the Food Stamp Act, which expanded access to food stamps to help people get food. He created Medicare, which was healthcare for the elderly, and Medicaid, healthcare for the poor. He increased expansion for education, and he abolished immigration quotas of the previous centuries, 1920s and whatnot. And under LBJ, he significantly reduced the amount of people who lived in poverty. This graph shows us the percentage of people and percentage of families who lived in poverty. By the time he takes over, 1960-ish, he's gone by 1969. So look at that massive drop from, what is this? 23% of people living in poverty all the way down to 12% by the time he left office. And that number will stay somewhat steady with some ups and downs. So I'm actually gonna add a box here for the Great Society, LBJ's Great Society. And LBJ sought to expand on FDR's New Deal with more social reforms. Again, I think his most notable ones is Medicare and Medicaid. And he cut poverty in half, which is a monumental achievement. Again, connecting to modern day, I'm recording this in early March. The Senate just passed the American Recovery Act, the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package of Joe Biden's. And what Joe Biden passed, or what's about to pass, is the most radical social reform legislation probably since what LBJ did. And so this push for the federal government to lead the charge in social reform, perhaps best exemplified by FDR, then LBJ, and then also President Biden. I should add that LBJ's successes were limited because he got kind of stuck in the quagmire of Vietnam, which we'll look at next lecture, and also high taxes, but that'll be a conversation for next week. Some other domestic changes. The Supreme Court under Earl Warren really reshaped America and expanded rights for people. Quick side note, my middle name is Warren. My dad's middle name is Warren, after Earl Warren. Earl Warren, before he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was the governor of California. And my dad's parents, so my grandparents, owned a Chinese restaurant in Sacramento, capital of California. And Earl Warren was known to have visited my grandparents' Chinese restaurant. So my dad was given the middle name Warren. I was given the same middle name, kind of in honor of Earl Warren, who, thank God, was kind of a champion of people's rights, because that'd be really awkward if he had an embarrassing legacy and I had his middle name. Anyways, under Earl Warren and the Supreme Court, Brown v. Board ended segregation in schools. He also expanded the rights of the accused, the idea of having your rights read to you, what's called your Miranda rights. That was under Earl Warren, Miranda v. Arizona, which said you must be made aware of your rights. The idea of, you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be provided for you. That was from Gideon v. Wainwright, the idea that poor defendants must be given an attorney. Mapp versus Ohio said that any evidence that was seized illegally by the police cannot be used against you in the court. And then the Warren Court also protected First Amendment rights, our freedoms. Yates versus the US said that radical and revolutionary speech, like communists might advocate for, is protected speech unless it poses a clear and present danger. Again, making another modern day connection, Donald Trump's words at the January 6th rally that led to the protests at the Capitol. Many people said that his words were not free speech because they posed a clear and present danger. And then Engel v. Vitale said that requiring prayers in public schools was unconstitutional against the First Amendment. So again, we'll say here, under Earl Warren, Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Supreme Court let's say, protected people's rights and freedoms, let's say. So some most notable ones, Brown v. Board, obviously, ended segregation. He protected the rights of the accused or of defendants. Whoops. And he protected our freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Again, fits thematically with what's happening in the 60s, civil rights movement, expanding rights, Supreme Court doing the same. And then amidst this whole era, last two slides looking at some of the cultural changes of the 50s and 60s. The most notable thing that happened in the 1950s was the creation, or I suppose the popularization of the television. By 1961, there were 55 million TV sets in the US, nearly one per family. And that began to change American culture. It began to first homogenize American culture, which meant that American culture became a monolith. It became one American culture because television kind of got to shape what people think. But it also led to more of a consumer culture. Advertising became very common. The economy became more consumer driven, of people buying things for themselves. Books, records, music rose in popularity as well. And so the 50s, I said, was characterized by consensus and conformity, which meant people kind of just assimilated to the broader culture. American culture became homogenized. It became one uniform culture. And everybody, not everybody, most people fit into that. There were some social critics that they called themselves beatniks. They kind of inspired the counterculture of the 60s. But some famous names, J.D. Salinger, who wrote, oh my God, Catcher in the Rye, Joseph Heller, who wrote, oh my God, Brave New World, I think, Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road, kind of exemplified the youth maybe challenging these social ideas. We'll get to that on the next slide. So the 1950s was kind of characterized by conformity and kind of one American culture. That's obviously simplifying things, but the television helped to create that one culture, and it also helped to create a consumer-driven economy. But there is some like youth rebellion by the beatniks, who would go to their jazz clubs and say their spoken word. That's kind of the stereotype of it. That counterculture really explodes in the 1960s. Inspired by the civil rights fight, many students, this was especially a student-led movement, also fought for a more liberal radical ideology. So the free speech movement at UC Berkeley fought for true and complete free speech. And that really came to exemplify the counterculture that became especially popular with the youth of America. Hippies, if you will, or flower children, going to Woodstock, listening to more progressive, different types of music, rock and roll. Drug use as well became much more common. Marijuana, sure, but LSD, acid, things like that. And with this rejection of like social mores, social norms, also came a rejection of a rejection of sexual norms, what's called the sexual revolution. Premarital sex became much more accepted, not frowned upon. Abortion and homosexuality also became much more open, more accepted, especially among the youth. And the birth control pill of 1960 was really a monumental chapter in that it gave women freedom over their own body. And so the pill really allowed women and the youth to push back against social norms and live a kind of freer, more independent life. Along with that sexual revolution and kind of women taking ownership of their bodies came the rise of like second feminism, I guess. The first rise of feminism was maybe 1848 with Seneca Falls, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and whatnot, fighting for suffrage. The second wave of feminism is fighting for what was called the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. Never actually became law, but women fighting for full equality. Women moving into new professions as well during this era. And then when we get to the Vietnam War, we'll also explore how this counterculture oftentimes protested against the Vietnam War, and how many of these protests were centered on college campuses. So if the 1950s was characterized by conformity, the 1960s was characterized by the exact opposite, by rebellion and counterculture. There was a fight for free speech on college campuses. And there was a counterculture that, I don't know, advocated for the freedom to live the life that they wanted to, man. Trying to figure out how to write this as a bullet point. I'll just say that rejected norms on drug use or dress or music or sex or things like that. And then I'll say that they oftentimes also protested the Vietnam War on college campuses, something we'll explore later. And so again, as we're looking at chapter 7, chapter 28, the biggest thing that we're seeing in domestic changes in the 50s and 60s is the civil rights era, led by Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent approach that leads to huge success with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I'm going to bold some key terms here. It's going to be a lot that I'm going to bold. In Brown v. Board as well. Don't have to memorize all of those, but you should for sure know at least a couple of those monumental acts of the civil rights era. So pause here. And then domestic changes as well. LBJ's Great Society pushing for more reforms. And then this counterculture of the 1960s that we'll explore much more next chapter.